The interview for this episode took place in late November 2022, 2 months prior to the devastating earthquake in southeastern Turkey. A few months after his Justice and Development Party, or AKP, won Turkey's general elections in 2011, then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan called on his fellow citizens to confront the past. Starting into his second decade in power, Erdogan proclaimed that those who do not confront their past cannot have a bright future. In the years that followed, several prominent sites of state-sponsored violence targeting ethnic and religious minorities and political opponents of the regime were slated to become memorials and museums. What inspired this desire to confront the past? What were these sites of memory? And how did the violent histories of these sites complicate these initiatives? To delve into these questions and more, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Arai Schuyler from the University of Hamburg to discuss his recent book, Victims of Commemoration, The Architecture and Violence of Confronting the Past in Turkey. Arai, thank you for joining this episode of Realms of Memory.
Thank you very much indeed, Rick. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you. Your own scholarship on North African communities in France has really kind of helped refocus memory and commemoration on dignity and justice rather than only focusing on narrative and representation. And my book contributes to that kind of shift of focus as well. So I feel especially excited about talking to a scholar like yourself, and I'm grateful to you for your interest.
To begin with, I was fascinated by the points that you made on another podcast about how some of the connections you made between what became this book really go back to this period of time where you had a grant or a scholarship and you studied in Vilnius. And I was hoping you could go back over that a little bit and discuss what were some of the insights that you gained that contributed to the book.
Sure. So the book is on Turkey, of course, and that's also where I was born and raised. But the kind of methodological origins of the book lie in that unlikely place that you mentioned, Vilnius. So in 2009, when I was still a master's student, I won a scholarship to attend a summer school on memorialization in Lithuania's capital, Vilnius. And there I encountered a kind of rich landscape of memory politics that I thought had quite interesting and unexpected, actually, resonances with what was at the time happening in Turkey. So Turkey at the time was seeing kind of discourses of confronting the past, or geçmişle yüzleşme in Turkish, and kind of reckoning with the past, geçmişle hesaplaşma. Kind of becoming mainstream and prevalent. And these discourses had been initiated in the mid to late 1990s by activists and intellectuals. But now, in the late 2000s, the AKP government was embracing this language of kind of confronting the past, reckoning with the past. And that was happening kind of near simultaneously with Turkey's kind of officially becoming a candidate for EU membership, in the context of which the government had launched a series of democratization initiatives called Açılım, or Açılımlar in plural, promising to address long-standing issues that have been affecting the country's kind of historically marginalized communities like Alevis, Kurds, and non-Muslims. So because much of this kind of historical marginalization actually revolved around state-sponsored violence, the government was now having to acknowledge the crimes of its predecessors, as it were. But not seldom through references to an alleged pre-nation state Ottoman tolerance and multiculturalism. Meanwhile, members of those marginalized communities and their political allies were campaigning for the transformation of sites of state-sponsored violence into memorial museums. And these campaigns soon became a kind of focal point for testing the sincerity of the government's willingness to acknowledge histories of state-sponsored violence. And for listeners, specifically, there are 3 such sites that were at the forefront of memorialization campaigns. And these are, of course, the ones I discuss in the book. Ulucanlar Prison in Turkey's capital, Ankara. Diyarbakir prison in Turkey's largest predominantly Kurdish inhabited city of the same name, Diyarbakir, and the Madımak Hotel in Sivas, Sivas being a city in central eastern Turkey. So Ulucanlar prison is associated with the revolutionary left, as it was where leaders of Turkey's 1968 student movement were hanged under the influence of the military. But more recently, in 2000, a violent military crackdown took place there and killed and maimed tens of political inmates who were protesting against the introduction of solitary confinement. Diyarbakir prison is where pro-Kurdish activists were tortured by the 1980s junta. And finally, Madımak Hotel in Sivas is where an arson attack targeted the participants of an Alevi-run culture festival in 1993, sort of before the eyes of a law enforcement that was completely passive and thousands of onlookers. The activist campaigns that had emerged throughout the 2000s for turning each of these sites into museums showed that space, material space, architectural space, was central to discourses and practices of confronting the past. But a critical perspective that takes spatiality seriously as a kind of a realm of memory politics onto itself had yet to emerge by the late 2000s. And it was my urge, therefore, to kind of contribute this sort of spatially focused perspective. So how I first felt this urge to take spatiality seriously, again, returns us to Vilnius and the summer school I attended there. Much of the summer school involved visits to sites, embroiled in histories of organized violence. Of course, some of these sites involved Soviet histories, which were significant to Lithuania, a nation kind of trying to find its feet in the post-Cold War era. But Lithuania had already witnessed, actually, 2 decades of, a liberal nationalist boost in self-confidence that followed its independence from the Soviet Union. And now a kind of more self-critical and reflexive memory politics was emerging, especially with respect to the Jewish history that Vilnius had. And its Jewish communities, obviously, were largely annihilated during the Holocaust. And now Lithuania's complicity in that annihilation was being reflected on. And this kind of self-reflection was taking place also in the context of the country's kind of integration into the EU, not unlike the process underway in Turkey at the time. Simultaneously, interestingly, a sort of imperial nationalist revivalism was also at work in Vilnius, with references to the alleged tolerance, magnificence, and benevolence of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is a state that existed between the mid-13th and 18th centuries. So I could here see clear parallels with the kind of Ottoman imperial nostalgia that was then becoming prevalent in Turkey. All of that prompted me to kind of approach the liberal politics of memory, not just kind of in terms of the democratization promises attached to them, but also kind of as the stuff of new power struggles that are kind of entangled in rather than distinct from the violent histories being memorialized. Now, as part of this summer school, I think more relevant methodologically was what we actually did, because a lot of what we did was based on visits to specific sites, talking to kind of designers of memorials and monuments, artists behind them, users of memorials and monuments, etc. And here we really kind of encountered a kind of significance that monuments can have that really transcends the intentions of the people who actually first authored them. For example, we encountered a Soviet-era monument that initially kind of was designed, obviously, to glorify a brotherly comradeship, which was initially slated for demolition, like many other Soviet monuments from the same era, when Lithuania became an independent republic. But it was in the 2000s claimed by Vilnius's gay community because they simply liked the way the monument looked. And they successfully campaigned to preserve this monument as a monument to gay pride. We also encountered a group of artists who had campaigned successfully to erect a kind of Frank Zappa monument, who is just someone that they really like, a musician whose work they liked, who has nothing to do with Lithuania's history, whether that history is Soviet or has to do with Holocaust, etc. But they just wanted a monument to an artist that they really loved. And that proved really difficult, actually, because the authorities, although this was supposed to be a liberal nation, they really came up with all sorts of reasons why this monument shouldn't be built, referencing things like public safety, health and safety, etc. Here I saw how kind of monuments and memorialization were really a realm for social and political organizing, and often a kind of organizing that transcended pre-existing communitarian allegiances attached to memory politics, involving, something like Frank Zappa fans and the gay community, as well as, of course, those who are in favor of reckoning with the Holocaust or reflecting on the Soviet era. So my experience in Vilnius prompted me to develop an approach that kind of considers materiality and spatiality, not simply as reflective, but rather as generative of the politics of violence and memory, and led me to use anthropological methods and to observe life in and around the three sites that my book discusses, so as to take their physicality seriously.
Is this an openness that's being forced on the government because it feels like, well, it's got to meet certain criteria if it's going to be accepted within the European community? Do you see a sincerity in what's going on, especially if it doesn't last that long? How do you interpret? Is it being? To me, it seems like it's being almost pushed on the government from the outside, an expectation from the outside, or maybe even from the ground up, from these different communities that as you mentioned, had been engaged for a while, maybe in a politics of recognition in Turkey. Is this a government that's being pushed from the outside, pushed from below, and in the end, it pushes back, and there's only so far it's willing to go. It hasn't evolved that much in terms of the memory work that it's done.
Again, as you're indicating, this was a time in the late 2000s, early 2010s, when Turkey was seen as and globally seen as a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. It's hard for us to remember that time from our current vantage point, but this was a time when government representatives were invited to publish op-eds in the likes of The Guardian, Newsweek, praising Turkey's democratization. And this was very much when, in 2011, the authorities first turned Ulucanlar prison, which is one of the sites I discuss, into a memorial museum proper, and redesigned the site of the Sivas arson attack, which was back then called the Madımak Hotel, as a kind of commemorative / educational space called the Science and Culture Center, with a memory corner dedicated to the atrocity. Around the same time, senior cabinet members, including Erdogan himself, who was then prime minister, pledged to close the Diyarbakir prison or to even turn it into a museum, although this never materialized. So all three sites I discuss in this book are or were at the heart of campaigns for site-specific memorial museums, but also at the heart of this moment when the kind of liberal approach to confronting the past is really kind of acknowledging the importance of these sites and wanting to kind of manifest or yield certain manifestations of this acknowledgement. And Ulucanlar became a museum proper that is open to the public. The Science and Culture Center that was set up in place of the Madımak Hotel is also actually a space now that is open to public visits, although it's not a museum proper. And Diyarbakir prison remains a prison and I discuss these different kind of kind of scenarios and their implications in the book. And so my interest again in this moment and the kind of space through the kind of particular spatial focus that I adopted in the book is to, in a way, leave to one side, whether a building has become a museum proper or not, which I think I fear kind of embroils us back in that kind of idea of certain kind of emblems or symbols of democratization being achieved successfully or not, right? Again, therefore, that I fear kind of places us back in that liberal kind of framing of confronting the past. Rather, I wanted to basically kind of go there, do the field work, regardless of whether a place has become a museum or not. And as I said, we have in this book 3 cases that represent a quite healthy spectrum of that kind of range of things that such buildings can become. One being a museum proper, another one being somewhere kind of halfway between a museum and a non-museum, and the final one being still kind of a prison. So what I wanted to do is to actually do this field work, to look at what's happening at these sites on a daily basis, to take their materiality and spatiality seriously, so that I don't actually repeat methodologically the problem that I begin with a certain abstract liberal ideal of confronting the past, but rather begin from the ground up, right? So kind of embrace that idea of that kind of bottom-up nature of what I think the politics of confronting the past should be, in my own methodology and through my own methodology as well, to look at the daily goings on at these sites, to look at how people mobilize around them, to actually observe kind of commemorative grassroots kind of commemorations that are taking place there, as well as, the public's visits in those sites that are actually open to visits, etc., to use the functional diversity that characterizes the 3 sites for appraising the kind of diverse sorts of political work that they generate.
Okay. I couldn't resist going off in that liberal tangent. Sorry. I was just intrigued by that context because I remember it vividly, and there was like a current within Turkey that was really all on board with going in the direction of European integration. And maybe in the end, it was a minority current. And that was the context that you really came of age in. So I just, really didn't know much about that particular context. But clearly it motivates the government to at least get behind the transformation of 2 of the 3 sites into memorial sites, at least to a certain extent. But you mentioned that when it does this, it kind of neuters them, right? It strips them of the complexity of the past that you find in these places. And I was hoping you could talk about how do they, when they get transformed into sites of memory, how do they get co-opted in the process?
So in transforming both the Madımak Hotel, that is the site of the Sivas arson attack, and Ulucanlar prison in Ankara, the authorities were kind of adamant, really, to treat violence as a thing of the past, as you're saying, and to progress kind of society into a kind of avowedly brighter, more democratic future. And this strategy has seen them kind of portray the violence that took place at these sites as perpetrated against the whole of Turkey, as it were. And that's what I call the nationalization of victimhood. In Sivas, for example, the memory corner that is now situated inside the site of the Sivas arson attack, that's been turned into this building that's called the Science and Culture Center, displays a list of victims' names that includes not only the tens of festival guests that were killed by the arsonists, but also two individuals who are known to have been members of the crowd outside. So also the statements accompanying this victims list speaks of the arson attack as a kind of sad, sorrowful incident that targeted the unity of Turkey. Right. So these are the more overtly problematic aspects of the official commemorative attitude that I, in the book, call nationalizing victimhood, which, as you say, kind of neutralizes the kind of sociopolitical specificity of what actually went down at these sites. But during my fieldwork at the building in Sivas, and to a certain extent also at Ulucanlar, I observed further problems that otherwise may not be so obvious. For example, at both sites, there's a kind of, there was, at the time of my research, a salient air of provisionality, right, which the authorities presented to the public as a democratic quality. So visitors to these sites that, again, are open to the public were told by employees that each site is an unfinished project and that visitor feedback is being collected so that these sites may be improved moving forward. In the specific case of the Madımak Hotel, much of the building actually is empty. It's just the ground floor and the mezzanine above it that has been transformed into what's now called the Science and Culture Center. The rest of the floors remain as they were at the point of the interior strip out that took place after the hotel was expropriated. So during my fieldwork, I realized that employees of the Science and Culture Center were presenting these empty floors to visitors as evidence of how open the authorities were to suggestions from the public regarding what the site could or should become in the future. But the interesting thing is that, let alone kind of moving society towards a democratic future, these emphases on provisionality, on the kind of unfinished, incomplete quality of the building actually extended the violent history into the future. They, for example, prompted far-right groups, as I discuss in the books, to speculate that the site will soon become a place of Alevi worship, closed to the wider public, dovetailing with a kind of conspiracy theoretical reading of the arson attack that sees it as an external plot orchestrated by kind of foreign powers against Turkey's unity, and that sees even some of the victims as pawns in that kind of conspiracy.
So that was another point that I was interested in. So if you have these spaces that are left unfinished, and this is supposed to invite participation, it's supposed to suggest an openness about these sites of memory, and in the end, it just fuels suspicions and feeds on conspiratorial thinking. You also mentioned that there's a long history of, and in fact, I found myself reading into your notes at the bottom of the page extensively because I thought it was really interesting. You were pointing out back to the creation of modern Turkey, that there's this long history of conspiratorial thinking.
Indeed, and this is, as you say, what I discuss in my footnotes, which are quite extensive, which I didn't want to kind of overshadow the kind of main kind of empirical kind of stuff of the book. The Sèvres paranoia, as it's known, right, is the kind of, if you want, the origin of this kind of conspiratorial thinking on the kind of institutional level in terms of state politics, because there is the Sèvres kind of agreement that kind of marked the transition from the Ottoman Empire into the Republic of Turkey, that is known to have been a kind of international agreement that came about in the aftermath of the First World War, where European powers, those who actually were victorious in that war against Germany and the Ottoman Empire, came up with a way of essentially, taking bits of the Ottoman Empire under their control, and then obviously this is known to have been what the Turkish national campaign, right? What is in Turkey known as the War of Liberation, or in national historiographies known as the Turkish War of Liberation, essentially the Turkish national campaign, is known to have been waged against this kind of Sèvres agreement of the kind of dividing up of the Ottoman Empire, which then, although obviously a lot of that was then reversed through the Turkish national campaign of 1919 and 1922. So between those dates is when the national campaign took place. But nevertheless, so although it's been reversed, it's turned into a paranoia, right? So this is what's called the Sèvres paranoia. That is this idea that foreign powers are continually working to divide Turkey up amongst themselves. That this is like a continuous threat that Turkey is facing. Now, in my book, I obviously situate the conspiratorial thinking that I encounter in places like Sivas within that tradition, but also show now, interestingly, how that actually gets kind of interwoven with a more, again, liberal kind of approach to confronting the past, all these discourses of reckoning with the past, which are supposed to be about liberalization, democratization, but which then end up being really kind of interwoven, interlaced with that longer tradition and overtly more nationalistic tradition of the Sèvres, the so-called Sèvres paranoia. So that's, I guess, my contribution here. I guess it would be kind of helpful to give some examples for the listeners. So, for example, there's a complete lack of historical information at the Science and Culture Center in Sivas. That is the site of the arson attack. You don't have any signage or labels, or the personnel working there have not been really instructed to give any information about what happened where. That is, except the one memory corner that is situated in the building, and that is the only kind of overtly the only element that is overtly linked and overtly commemorates the events in the state's own way. So but other parts, many parts of the building. What I noticed was that many other parts of the building also drew great interest from the visitors, and that is due to the widely circulated images and testimonies that have popularized, what took place in what part of the building, when, etc., during the atrocity. So visitors sought information that was specific to various parts of the building, which is not at all provided by the institution. And this lack of information created a kind of epistemic hole that invited speculation and conspiracy theorizing. On top of all that, during the activist commemorations that are held there at the site annually, by those kind of upholding the legacy of the victims and therefore underscoring the sociopolitical specificity of the atrocity, the law enforcement actually goes to great lengths to separate the commemorative procession from the rest of the city. So on the one hand, there's supposedly tolerance and incorporation of this kind of activist commemoration within the life of the city, and it's permitted. On the other hand, it's strictly spatially and materially separated from the rest of the city. So this kind of spatial configuration that isolates those seeking commemorative justice from the rest of the ordinary, as it were, residents of Sivas, reinforces the idea that those bent on remembering are outsiders or foreign elements. Even the fact that many Alevis who travel to Sivas for the annual commemoration indeed live outside of the city, which is a fact, is manipulated as evidence of their being outsiders. Whereas, of course, the very reason why they live outside of Sivas in the first place today is a result of the atrocities like the arson attack, which led them to flee those kinds of parts of Turkey like Sivas. So many of them fled to other parts of Turkey or even to Europe. And it was there that they, for the first time, found the opportunity to organize around such causes as the Sivas arson attack and remembering its victims. So once they regrouped in places like, say, Germany or elsewhere in Turkey, like Ankara, they began to travel to Sivas to commemorate the arson attack. But I noticed that during these commemorations that were supposedly being tolerated and given a space, they were now cast as foreigners, not unlike the foreign powers that were supposedly behind the kind of Sèvres agreement, and since then have been behind repeatedly, supposedly, such violent episodes as the arson attack itself, kind of supposedly plotting these kind of plots to harm Turkey's unity. So my point is that kind of addressing these issues plaguing the work of memory and justice requires that we understand violence and commemoration as not ontologically distinct from one another, but rather as entangled in one another, and that we focus their entanglement on the materiality and spatiality of sites of violence, because they display both continuities with longer-standing histories, such as the Sèvres affair, etc., but also new ways in which they are incorporated into kind of ideas of liberal tolerance and democratization.
I know I keep veering off here, but at the same time, I'm wondering, is this just a regime that is struggling to deal with its own diversity? You take a site like the Science and Cultural Center, and they don't want it to be politicized, and so they'll devote a memory corner to it, but it includes everyone, even people that lit the building on fire, right? And but what stunned me when I was reading that section was that the people who were working there weren't even trained or weren't encouraged to provide any kind of education, and that the people who would venture into the space, and I thought you made a really interesting point about how the building was just completely uninviting. Right? People didn't know what it was from the outside. And then when you go in, it's not like you have a trained staff that is there to educate you about at least about what happened to the original building. In fact, they're discouraged to do that, and people are almost trying to piece it together on their own. There's a natural curiosity. I really like that part when you were pointing out how people are kind of gravitating towards these stairwells, and they're trying to see, well, what actually happened to the victims, and trying to figure things out for themselves, because there was no one to really explain it. Then if you did explain it, you get in trouble. So to me, it was almost like kind of like paying lip service to this incident that affected this particular community, and you transform this building. But then when it came down to it, you're not really trying to train anyone to educate anyone about what happened. And then when these gatherings take place for the Alevi community, you want to keep as much distance from them, from that community in the building as possible, because you don't want it to get politicized.
Again, this is the point, the reason why I discuss a bunch of sites, 3 sites in this book, not just the hotel, the Madımak Hotel turned Science and Culture Center in Sivas, but also Ulucanlar Prison, because there you see, obviously each site has its specificities. In Sivas, you could argue, as you have indicated, Rick, that it's not a museum, and there's a kind of certain avoidance, if you want, of certain questions. In Ulucanlar, there's much more of an overtly comfortable kind of narrative that we are being presented. This is a museum that is kind of that presents itself as a museum that confronts the history of the coup d'etats that Turkey witnessed in the late 20th century. But the way it actually presents these coups, this history of coups, is that they were kind of plotted against, again, a kind of idea, a generic idea of democracy, right? And this is, again, maybe something that is familiar to us in the aftermath of the coup, the most recent, the latest coup attempt that took place in July 2016, with which some listeners may be familiar. So what I discuss in the book is a kind of precursor to this kind of response that the state has had, the government has had to the latest coup attempt that took place on the 15th of July 2016, which has also been kind of presented as a coup against democracy. That is democracy in the sense of basically going to the ballot box to vote, right? Whereas I try to kind of show how our notions of democracy might actually involve and should involve the work of political organizing, mobilizing, and indeed certain ideologies, specific ideologies that were actually targeted by the violent histories that I discuss in the book. So in the Ulucanlar Museum, prison museum, right? So right-wing leaders who were in fact among the instigators of some of the violent histories, the most violent outbreaks against Turkey's marginalized communities, are remembered side by side with revolutionary figures. Whereas actually, if you look at the kind of work that secured when the prison was evacuated in 2006, the work of organizing, mobilizing that secured the preservation of that prison as a kind of space of memory and its eventual transformation into a prison. Who did do that kind of work was actually the veteran revolutionary leftist organizations in collaboration with the Chamber of Architects, which you could say is also kind of left-leaning. So when the prison was shut down in 2006, they organized a series of workshops and even a kind of architecture competition to imagine what the prison could be turned into. The first reaction on the part of the authorities was to engage with this campaign, and they even promised to implement the winning entry in that architecture competition. But at some point during the implementation phase, the revolutionary leftists, veteran leftists, you could say, were sidelined, and the museum, as we know it today, came to be, which is again a space that remembers the coups that took place in the second half of the 20th century in Turkey, but does so by kind of glossing over the ideologies that they were enacted for and against, right? So my argument here is not that this is an incorrect take on history and the correct version would have been to narrate it otherwise. My point here is that the historiographical correctness or incorrectness that we have in mind here must be based on who actually put in the political work of organizing and mobilizing to claim this space successfully, and to what extent their ideas are being reflected in the final outcome, which in this case is virtually nil. The one item on exhibit that symbolizes this depoliticization and decontextualization most strikingly is the gallows. The museum displays the former prison's gallows behind bars to show that Turkey abolished the death penalty. Now, of course, the very reason why this particular gallows became infamous is that it was used in executing the three leading members of Turkey's 1968 revolutionary student movement. But this is not at all acknowledged at this exhibit. The associations set up by veteran members of that movement have actually campaigned for the museum to return the gallows to them because they consider themselves to be the rightful heirs. Indeed, they annually organize their own exhibition to commemorate the victims. And this is where they want the gallows to be displayed with their own historiography attached to it. So the political work of organizing and mobilizing really is what I would like to highlight here. And it actually does indeed continue to challenge the depoliticization and decontextualization that we're talking about.
So you mentioned that the media is such an important part of the defining of these spaces, whether they're reporting on what's going on in a prison or they're reporting on this arson attack at the hotel. And we tend to think of, especially within the context that you're writing about, this context of democratization, as the media being a force in the direction of democratization, but it doesn't really seem to work that way, at least in certain cases. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the role of the media in shaping the meaning of these sites of memory.
Yes, that's a crucial question, Rick, and actually one that is quite context specific, because in the context of the 1990s, the question of the media was really kind of central to a certain idea of an expansion of the public sphere. Right. So the early to mid 1990s, when the Sivas arson attack took place, was a period when Turkey was supposedly witnessing this kind of expansion of the public sphere as it was now recovering from the violent 1980 coup d'etat. The culture festival that was targeted in the arson attack was organized by representatives of the Alevi community, very much to partake in this alleged expansion of the public sphere. The festival had been organized in the countryside in an Alevi village called Banaz, and with an exclusively Alevism-oriented lineup of events and contributors. But now, for the first time in 1993, the festival was being held in central Sivas, and the program and the participants were not only Alevism-related. So it was very much this kind of staking of a claim for a place in an allegedly expanding public sphere that characterized the culture festival. And actually staking this claim spatially, right, by moving to central Sivas, that was targeted in the arson attack. So privatization of media, or specifically of radio and television, which had only just taken place at the time, was considered among the hallmarks of Turkey's expanding public sphere in the 1990s. How the arson attack unfolded, though, tells a darker story. So a private television network that had just been set up was broadcasting from the city during the arson attack. They indeed broadcasted the arson attack near live from the scene. While intuition might assume that this was conducive to the whole nation becoming aware of the atrocity, the broadcast had actually the opposite effect in a context where anti-Alevi discourse was rampant and many Alevi families, in fact, still hid their faith for fear of discrimination and racist attacks. The broadcast, therefore, exacerbated the horror of the attack for these families. So several children from Alevi families have since then shared the kind of testimony, the memory that when they first found out that they were indeed Alevis was on the night when footage of the arson attack arrived at screens nationwide. The kids would see their parents react to the footage by saying, "They're burning us," and would then ask their parents, "Who are we? Who's us?" To then be told, "We are Alevis." So that was really effectively the first time that many kids found out that they were, in fact, Alevis. So what's crucial here is that the television network that was involved in this affair didn't just broadcast the atrocity as such, but also instigated it to a certain extent. Reporters from this network had been asking provocative questions in public to some of the festival's guests with crowds around them, and these crowds would then react angrily to the responses that the guests would give, with the resulting tensions kind of significantly rising in the process. And obviously these microaggressions then kind of contributed to the arson that was also collectively perpetrated and spectated. So a kind of specific visual, you could say televisual characteristic of the footage that was broadcast was this emphasis on the thousands a visual emphasis on the thousands that converged around the Madımak Hotel. The crowd was visually made to replace the festival organizers and participants as the ideal public that constitutes the publicness of an expanded public sphere. It was almost as if they had converged, naturally and organically around this site as a public. But we now know that obviously that wasn't the case, and I owe this insight to another visual producer, to the director Medet Dilek, who produced a documentary on the arson attack titled Narcolepsy. In this documentary, Dilek combines footage from mainstream media that we're familiar with footage from the personal cameras of Alevi residents of Sivas, who in a way counter-documented the events from their own situated positionality. These were residents living in a particular neighborhood of Sivas, which in fact has been known as the Alevi neighborhood, and their footage documents how they took to the streets in outrage at the violent developments that they saw and heard on the afternoon of the attack, but were then actively stopped by law enforcement from leaving their neighborhood on grounds that their arrival at the scene would create even bigger turmoil. Meanwhile, law enforcement, of course, was essentially giving free rein to the crowd outside the hotel. So watching this Alevi-produced counter-documentation against the more popular images from the TV network shows us that the crowd outside the hotel were actively and visually given this appearance of the ideal public. Indeed, the morning after, leading state representatives such as the Prime Minister were asked about the casualties, and the first thing they said was, and I quote, "Thankfully, our people outside the hotel were unharmed." This kind of evidences the kind of spatial visual link that was being forged between the crowd outside the hotel and the idea of the public. And this was, again, a televisual kind of link, right? So publicness actually has since continued to be controversial upon following the hotel's transformation into Science and Culture Center. Now that the building was expropriated, i.e., it became public property, the authorities attempted to use this new status of the building to prevent activists from commemorating the atrocity there annually. They told activists that the building had now become kamusal alan, or public space in Turkish, in the sense of state-sanctioned space. Memory activists challenged this restrictive notion of publicness and put into practice their own idea of public space in the process. They, for example, mobilized a notion of meydan, which is the word for public square, but which also happens to be a kind of notion specific to Alevism, that has socio-judicial significance. It's a spatial institution in the Alevi faith where wrongdoings are debated and addressed collectively, and often also with a view towards reparation rather than punition. Activists referred to the forecourt of the building as a meydan, therefore kind of mobilizing this notion from their situated position to confront notions of kamusal alan, or public space, as state-sanctioned space, which again bears the resonances of how the event was also kind of televisually mediated in the 90s.
I think you try to make a point, too, that there's a long history of Alevi martyrdom. But if you look at how Alevis get galvanized and how they return to Sivas in greater numbers to commemorate what happened, you misunderstand that if you see it in terms of this history of a community that sees themselves as a victimized population, that you really need to understand how the media shapes that identity, and for people maybe who didn't necessarily weren't necessarily politicized by that identity. At least that's what I took away from that it's in watching that, and maybe, like you said, in part by their own coverage, that on the one hand, you have this public space that gets claimed for other groups, the right, religious conservatives, and at the same time, Alevis get politicized. Maybe they get driven from the country, but it's that identity that draws them back to that space to try to reclaim it.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad that that idea has come across to you, Rick, because that's well, that was very much my intention. Is, well, first of all, to acknowledge the importance of martyrdom to Alevism as a general kind of framework, kind of religious framework, but also to show that that is taking specific effects in that specific context of Sivas, and those effects are informed by spatial knowledge of the city, actually. And this is where things become more complicated, because that spatial knowledge, as we've said, is also visually mediated, etc. So for listeners, maybe it's useful to explain the kind of specific idea of martyrdom that has an important place in the Alevi faith. So martyrdom here is distinguished by kind of non-violent defense of justice before the oppressor. So Alevism considers as martyrs those figures who have passively resisted oppression in defense of justice. The social and political context of martyrdom, therefore, is crucial here. And it's not based on active aggression, but rather kind of resistance to aggression. And this actually allows within the Alevi faith for a sacred lineage that's not based on birth, but rather on politically specific death at the hands of oppressors. So again, martyrdom does give activists a framework within which to create historiographies of events, past and present, including not just the arson attack itself, but also the kind of predicaments that they face during annual commemorations. Now, when an activist commemoration is attempted to be blocked by the authorities, leading figures of the community participating in the event might call the measure or these attempts as a continuation of previous massacres and centuries-long tyranny of hegemonic powers that slew our martyrs in history. So, but what I'm kind of trying to emphasize here is that martyrdom is actually serving as such a historiographical framework here, due not only to its general religious significance, but also in a spatially specific way that has to do with spatial knowledge of Sivas and its history. Again, the spatially charged, visually mediated kind of representation of, or a way in which the footage of the attack was broadcast is important here. First, this had a kind of spatiality that has kind of affected memory of the event due to the kind of extensive use of long shots, right, through which the vastness of the crowd surrounding the hotel was foregrounded. Secondly, similarly, it was actually experienced, the footage was experienced kind of unevenly, differently across the viewership. And this differentiation derived from, well, one's experience of having been Alevi and having become subjected to anti-Alevi sentiments, but also spatial knowledge of Sivas and its history. So Pir Sultan Abdal, who's the 16th century minstrel, after whom the 1993 festival targeted by the arsonists was actually named, is significant here. So Pir Sultan is a prominent martyr whose legacy is upheld by Alevis. And he not only names his name not only kind of titled the festival that was targeted in the arson attack, but he's also significant because he is reputed to have been hanged in the 16th century by the then Ottoman governor of Sivas at a spot not far from the Madımak Hotel itself, where the Sivas arson attack took place. So one activist in her 20s that I talked to drew this link between Pir Sultan, the arson attack victims, and the commemoration participants in a spatial way. She suggested that Pir Sultan was murdered just around the corner from where they are kind of oppressing us today, and where our martyrs were slain yesterday meaning the arson attack. So actually a set of statues that commemorate certain Alevi victims of the Sivas arson attack in their ancestral villages in a certain region of Sivas that's known as the Emlek region are also known as martyrs' monuments. And they are modeled on a 1978 monument to Pir Sultan Abdal that is located in this minstrel's native village, Banaz, in rural Sivas. So in sum, I think martyrdom is significant to the commemorative culture around the arson attack, not only as a kind of ethnically based religious trope, but also as a kind of politically specific and spatially informed one.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned these martyrs' monuments. They're built in these Alevi villages after the Sivas arson attack, right? That this happens. They're modeled after this older one, and then you bring up this point about geography having, different layers of histories of violence, and how you encounter these in unexpected, unanticipated ways, and something that you didn't really intend to work on or weren't looking into, which just kind of cropped up in your research and your field work. So I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit. And you mentioned that when you were looking at some of the geography surrounding some of the monuments, that you encountered these unexpected connections that people would make, and how they would interpret the present through the lens of violence in the past.
Indeed. And the most kind of salient references to those kind of seemingly other distinct kind of histories of violence being made here was with the Armenian genocide. So, and this indeed, to go back to my previous answer to your question, this is part of the spatial knowledge of Sivas that I'm talking about, that actually then renders something like martyrdom as being much more than just kind of an ethnic framework, a religious framework, but also one that is potentially continually open to these kind of unexpected encounters with seemingly distinct histories that you're mentioning in your question. So Sivas province was home to a significant Armenian population prior to the genocide, nearly 15% of its total population, according to the census, the Ottoman census of 1914. Which we have to take with a grain of salt, because censuses had their shortcomings, and in fact, the percentage, if anything, was significantly higher in city centers. So, as part of my fieldwork, I spent time in this rural region that I was mentioning, in Sivas province, the region that's called the Emlek region, where today the concentration of Alevi villages is particularly high. An activist in his 50s who hails from this region, and with whom I was exploring the landscape at some point, gestured to a kind of tributary bordering one of the villages there as Sevkiyat Brook. Sevkiyat meaning in Turkish consignment. So this is where, the activist explains, the region's Armenians were gathered in 1915 and deported eastward by orders of the then Ottoman government, kind of quote unquote consigned eastward, right? So there were other tributaries that those hailing from the region called as, for instance, Kanlı, or bloody in Turkish, or Karanlı, which is kind of a word that's corrupted from karanlık, which means dark. So Kanlı Brook witnessed the massacre of Armenians from another part of the region. The stream, my interlocutor said, ran blood red for months. Now, when I kind of prompted them to elaborate on these vernacular names, the activists started to really, actively discuss their ancestors' kind of relationship to something like the Armenian genocide. So, one, for instance, said, "My grandpa was tasked with taking them meaning Armenians, further east. That's all he did. He didn't kill anyone." Another one said that the killers always came from Sunni villages, Sunni being this other kind of religious kind of community that is actually the kind of religious majority, technically speaking, at least in Turkey still, and that is distinct from the Alevi minority. And another one said that Alevis did what they could. Many Armenians sought refuge in our villages, but had we been able to do more back then, what we later experienced might also have been different. Meaning, the kind of atrocities like Sivas arson attack that took place much later in the 20th century. So these conversations would return to the Sivas arson attack and kind of in indirect ways, often not so much in direct ways, but indirectly kind of interweave the arson attack in this history of the Armenian genocide. Now, a similar instance in central Sivas during the activist commemorations actually involved this kind of apricot orchard. I would perhaps like to maybe avoid giving any lengthy stories or even spoilers because the details are in the book, but suffice it to say here that I discuss in this instance in the book where memory activists respond to the authorities' attempts at blocking the commemoration by relating this experience not only to something like Pir Sultan's hanging in the 16th century at a nearby spot, etc., but also to this seemingly unrelated violent episode that is the Armenian genocide. So if you piece together my conversations with activists, as I try to do in the book, it shows that the Armenian genocide is an important historical locus among a few select loci through which activists weave and continually reweave understandings of and interpretations of violent episodes like the arson attack. And more recent developments they find to be continuous with it. Such as the oppressive attitudes they face during commemorations. And the point I make here is that this obliges us to attend to trans-ethnic and non-sectarian connections that commemorative communities draw between histories that are otherwise assumed to only concern a particular ethnic community.
What I thought was fascinating, too, is that there's this whole reading of the landscape that it's almost like this persistence of memory at the local level. There's this you filtering, especially natural disasters you mentioned, are filtered through this understanding of the landscape as almost like a cursed by the past. And so what you saw in Sivas, I think you mentioned, is not isolated. The other scholars have encountered this reading of the landscape as well.
Exactly. Well, I discuss the more kind of disaster-related, in the sense of natural disasters, related aspect of this in an article, actually, a journal article that I wrote for the Études Arméniennes Contemporaines in 2016. So listeners who are interested in this kind of connection might be interested in that article. The kind of, in a nutshell, the kind of point that I make here, or the kind of premise really is that disasters and catastrophes, right, and the Armenian genocide is often known to Armenians as a catastrophe in that most kind of literal sense of the word. We should think them together, right? So maybe the kind of affair of the issue of natural disasters are things that assume meaning and take effect in close relation, in arguably inextricable relation with the political disasters and catastrophes like the Armenian genocide.
I love the story that you told about the Citadel Museum, that you think that you're discovering the bones of Kurdish victims, right? But they turn out to be from a totally different time period, and people want to just move away from that as fast as possible. At the same time, there's this awareness that maybe this is the history that's coming around again.
Yes, indeed. And in that article where I discussed that kind of encounter as an accidental encounter, but I here use a specific notion of accidentality or accident that I borrow from anthropologist Rosalind Morris, because her notion is that accidents take place in specific sites due to their specific material spatiality. right? So they're not just accidents in kind of a vague, abstract, general sense, but they're kind of, there's a reason why they take place, where they take place. And that's the kind of notion of accident that I borrow from her. And I kind of show how there's a reason why that encounter with the bones there happens there. And indeed, there is actually, if you look at the kind of work of scholars like Adnan Çelik and Namık Kemal Dinç, who have documented extensively oral traditions, what we now can call traditions, although they're kind of more recent traditions than ancient traditions in Kurdistan, in Turkey's Kurdistan, where locals kind of talk about specific landforms and name these landforms and whatever kind of seemingly natural disasters that might happen at these kind of parts of the landscape in Kurdistan, as kind of a legacy of the Armenian genocide. There's a book that they wrote, which is a kind of oral history book that I would highly recommend. That's called Yüzyıllık Ah, which kind of translates as a century-old curse. That's my translation, obviously. So the book is in Turkish, but those among the listeners who do speak Turkish might be interested in that book, because that's a fascinating oral history that shows that indeed the local population to this day actually speak of parts of the landscape as bearing the legacy of the Armenian genocide.
Now, would you put the to return to this prison museum? I think you mentioned that. There's an incident. Well, I mean, this was the prison that wasn't converted into a museum, right? That the outer walls were painted, and this evokes a memory of another earlier period of violence, at least among prisoners who experienced it. And would this be another case of an accidental encounter with the past?
Surely, in the sense of the particular notion of accident that I again kind of borrow from Rosalind Morris, because this is technologically specific, right? So in that part of the book that you mentioned, I discuss this act of painting walls, which is seemingly very mundane and banal, in fact, can actually turn out to serve as a technology of contending with violence, and can do so in unexpected ways. So in 1980s, Diyarbakir prison, a prominent torture method was to force political inmates to paint the prison's walls with racist nationalist slogans and symbols. The torturers often spoke of the prison as a school, and the forced painting as a method of educating the prisoners about becoming better Turks. So this technology was then repurposed by 4 prisoners who killed themselves by self-immolation in May 1982 to protest against the torture that was taking place inside the prison. The inmates had gradually and surreptitiously stockpiled the highly combustible materials they were forced to use in painting the walls. While this was doubtless an act of defiance against the anti-Kurdish violence that was taking place inside the prison and beyond, actually, veteran prisoners have recounted to me how it also had direct practical consequences. So the policy of forced painting indeed ceased to exist afterwards, as the authorities feared further instances of self-immolation. So they directly eliminated this torture method. Come the late 2000s, when discourses of confronting the past began to figure prominently, and when Diyarbakir prison's transformation into a memorial museum was being debated, the authorities wanted to display their willingness to move on from the violent history by collaborating with the local university's art education department to decorate the prison's outer walls. The art students were instructed to decorate the outer walls of the prison with duplicates of well-known paintings by Juan Miró and Pablo Picasso, alongside education-themed quotes from early 19th century European intellectuals like Honoré de Balzac and statesmen like Henry Brougham. Survivors of the prison found this strikingly reminiscent of how the torturers had forced them to paint the inner walls as part of their so-called education in Turkishness. So there are these kind of technological aspects of the built environment that serve as political mechanisms in their own right. And they bring along their own political meanings acquired through violent histories. Interestingly, but also crucially, former political inmates who served time in the 1980s Diyarbakir prison and with whom I talked told me that when the building becomes a museum, as they would like it to, they will repaint these murals themselves because they would like everyone to see how torturous the act was in this context. So they have aimed to repurpose the violent associations of this kind of technology of painting for claiming their own historiographical and political agency.
After spending more than a decade at institutions such as University College London and the London School of Economics, Arai Schuyler is incoming professor of human geography at the University of Hamburg. He is the author of Victims of Commemoration, The Architecture and Violence of Confronting the Past in Turkey. Arai, thank you again for joining this episode of Realms of Memory.
Thank you so much indeed, Rick, for taking the time to engage with the book so generously and carefully.
Next month, we turn to the story of memory activism in Israel. We'll hear from Yifat Gutman, author of Memory Activism, Reimagining the Past for the Future in Israel-Palestine. If you've enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend and leave a review on your favorite podcast app. I'm your host, Rick Dadarian. Thanks again for listening to Realms of Memory.